Welcome to Unmoored, America adrift in historical forgetfulness and finding our way back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kreisman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Good afternoon, Matthew. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, man, I'm doing all right.
Man, it is good to be back in the studio with you.
Yeah.
Well, this is our last time.
Yeah, how about that?
I can't believe it. I think I have been remiss, though, in all of our episodes since episode 2 to not check on something very important. Are you still playing chess?
You know what, Carl? Thank you for not shying away from the hard topics.
There you go. I want to dig in.
The people have been listening all this time.
They've been wondering what's going on with the chess game.
Yes, history, but what's Matthew's chess game like? I have been playing.
Good.
I wish I could report that I've gotten better. Maybe it's on some incremental...
Yeah, over time. It gets better over time.
Yeah, I mean, just...
Let's get beat up a bunch.
I've been pummeled, and I finally said, you know what? I'm going back to like the super easy mode. And so I'm playing the little chess bot, and I won, and I feel good. And
it is a good feeling.
But they're like, well, this chess bot is to represent somebody who has no spatial differentiation and is colorblind. I'm like, don't take this away from me. I won.
Nice. I noticed sometimes, well, I haven't played much, but the last few times when I played, I realized I didn't win. The computer helped me win.
You're right. You could see when they make a move and you're like, oh, I just feel condescended to now.
I got nothing.
Should I go here?
I got nothing. I try to get better, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Well, this is going to be our last session. I'll warn you now, audience, that we might go so long that I will split it without any fanfare. There'll be 2 episodes. This is number 11. We might have a 12 without any, there won't be even an intro. We'll just dive back in on episode 12. But this is our last time. You know, in one sense, there's a part of me that thinks, well, I don't need to do this session. I set out to be a guide. I felt like there was a problem. I think the general key part of the problem is that we don't know our history. And by forgetting our history, people have come to poor conclusions. And I think we've sort of set that out. I mean, that's kind of what I've tried to do, and I think we've gotten there. I guess my wife in particular was like, you're going to have a conclusion, aren't you? I'm like, yeah, I guess I probably should. I said in one of the earlier episodes that I was going to be very conscious, and we both were, that we're not hiding some massive solution that put me in charge of the country, I can fix things, because it's not that simple.
Right.
That would really be an unfair thing to consider. I will say, though, and that's what we're going to do today, is walk through, ideas of things that I think are observable, that based on what we've seen and based on the history, it's sort of like an offering. It's like, here's an offering to our various listeners, our different characters we've set up, our different characters. And, well, I think this might be something of value to see, kind of a thing. And I guess maybe a good place to start is, look, we are recording this in the election season of 2024. Okay? So when I started releasing this and telling people I was doing this, people were like, oh, and they were excited and nervous. And we haven't, if you've listened all the way to this point through all the episodes, we haven't mentioned names, don't plan on doing it today. But that sense of the election for many people, I think, has carried with it a rising of tension-filled events, choices being made that for some might feel like there's foreboding or problems, and that makes me think of Tolkien, and in Lord of the Rings, the king of Rohan, Theoden, finds himself besieged in Helm's Deep. It's a fortress that has never been taken, but there's an overwhelming number of the bad guys who are out there. They have evil intent. And so he says in despair, quoting Tolkien now my heart is doubtful. The world changes, and all that was once strong now proves unsure. How shall any tower withstand such numbers and such reckless hate? And in the movie, if you remember how Bernard Shaw did that, I think it's Bernard Shaw, it was when he was getting, he was finally besieged. He's kind of hopeless. And this is the moment in the movie where Aragorn says, let's ride out. But this idea of such reckless hate. And I think many people would say, usually looking at the quote unquote other side, that they feel that way. Oh, there's such reckless hate. But that sense of like, it's just not a good scene. So then you asked me at the end of episode 2, or maybe going into episode 2, we talked about, are things hopeless? Remember that?
I do.
Do you feel like things are hopeless?
I don't think they're hopeless. I'll tell you what I think. I think of Jeremiah 29.
Yep.
Like a very hopeful verse.
Yeah.
But in context, it's like,
Yeah.
there's hope. That said, it's going to be a little grim for
Yeah.
a couple generations.
To use a word we've used, it's not a triumphal hope in the sense of conquering over your enemies or getting what you want. It's a hope of the God of the Jewish people in that time saying, I am with you, and I have not abandoned you.
Yeah.
That kind of a thing.
Patient hope.
Well, hopefully you and the listeners also can hear in the material we've talked about, the historical evidence we've looked at all the way since really episode 4. We really dug in episode 4 into the history and kind of carried it forward. You could say, well, there are reasons to be hopeful. I can see things in the past that can guide us. There's some answers maybe too strong, but there's pathways. I mean, we said we're unmoored, and maybe people say, I don't want to go backwards, thinking backwards as to some worldview that they don't like. And I'm like, okay, cool, let's go forward. We have to go forward, though, to something that's hopeful, something that's going to provide us a solace. I guess I would want to say, when you look at history and when you look at chaos times, the vast majority of us lived through it. The worst one that we know of that kind of covered a larger group of people would be the bubonic plague in the 1300s in Europe. 40, in some places 50% of people died. So whatever the thing was we had in 2020, it's not even in the same league. Ours had a larger scope globally than that one did. But except in a very few places, there were some places where 60% died. We lived through it.
Yeah.
So whatever this thing is we're in, it's not like when some conclusion comes, we're all going to die. So that's got a level of hope in itself, I think. The question is, how do we handle the aftermath? And I think that's a part of what I was wanting to do here. It's not I can pull us out of this nosedive that we're in. I don't know that that's possible, although we're going to offer some ideas. But we will live through it. And on the other side, when there's a sense of now we're on another side, and people are like, well, I want to reestablish or start up again, or in my village or in my community, I want to live a certain way. I don't want to go through that again. I want there to be in the historical record, me offering to people, here's your answer. Here's how you go through it. That, you go forward thinking, how do I engage with my neighbors? How do I position myself as someone who wants flourishing for all? Remember what I said at the end of episode 1, I don't think most people are wanting to be hateful or see themselves as angry. And in general, I think everybody kind of wants there to be positive. And so we're going to live through it. We have to be careful how we come out. There's times in the past we've had national crisis, and I would suggest if you examine that history, there's moments when it could be stated that wasn't handled well, particularly Reconstruction wasn't handled well, but I would even offer at the years after the American Revolution for the Loyalists wasn't handled well. So there's hope.
Yeah, that's good. Well, kind of taking a stock, looking back at the last couple of episodes, we delved into the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. So, kind of color commentary, play-by-play. Want to run this by you because there are some aspects, if a historian is touching on those events, those documents, that they would delve into that you did not get into. Is there a why behind that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought about, I literally, the week we recorded about the Constitution, I spoke locally at a senior event, a club, about 400 or 500 people, and they asked me to speak about the ratification of the Constitution. So there's a lot of things that can be talked about if we're saying if someone says, I want to compare like our government or our sense of our civic life today versus when we started. And those have merit. I mean, there's things that I think are worthwhile kind of covering. In fact, let me cover some of those, right? So for instance, so some of the things that are typically like brought up, say in a political sciencey kind of way, that you say, what can we learn from those moments? And we didn't emphasize it necessarily in those two episodes. So one is obviously, not obviously perhaps, but the people are affirmed as first. This is crucial. Another way of saying it, another historian who I really like says, is the government us or is the government them? And the founders' view, and I mean the 2 million people who set it all up, their view was they wanted to make the experiment of us doing it. Right. Now, obviously, that viewpoint of us or them kind of becomes in the eye of the beholder and how they perceive what's happening around them. And even early on when President Washington was in office, there were people beginning to think of them making bad decisions and not us. And that's because decisions are being made opposite of what they perceived as what they wished. So that's part of it. Another thing is that the people are affirmed, you really get this in the Declaration, of having rights outside of or before government. Government never gives you rights. Right. You can say, particularly with our 14th Amendment, the government should protect my rights, but they're not protecting rights that they have given. They're protecting rights that, back to Jefferson, who's leaning into Locke, that come from God. Right. Or as Jefferson said, the creator, nature's God, right? So that's the key part. That power of the central government is very limited. And they had a deep concern about what would happen with an executive branch. And now remember, when we moved from the Articles of Confederation, which we talked about in the 1776 episode, to the Constitution, one of the controversial things was that Madison, Hamilton, and the guys doing the Constitution wanted there to be more power in the central government. And they did. As I usually, when I'm teaching this, I talk about it being a move toward Thomas Hobbes, because Hobbes believes the only way to have a social contract that provides flourishing is with, we would use the phrase, a dictatorial level of power in the central government. Madison and those guys weren't saying that, but they were moving away from Locke, which is why their opponents like Sam Adams and Hancock, they disagreed and they didn't like it. And the Constitution, as we looked, barely passed, right? But so even in the Constitution, the power of the nation is limited. Then another aspect, which we've certainly lost this in our day, and again, all these things, somebody could say, well, we don't do that today, which I'll get to in a second, is that power is divided. And it even needs to be at odds. So the founders at one level, if you ask them, and they didn't have political parties when we started, but using our political parties, if you said, do you want one of the political parties to control all three branches, president, House, Senate, and that's a thing there about the divided, many of them, include specifically John Adams, perceived that Congress was not to be a holistic group of buddies working together, but two houses that were often at odds with each other. And they divided who had what. And that's a place where our Congress for at least 100 years has really dropped the ball, and they don't really do those things that the Constitution says they and they alone should do, right? But so if you said, do you want the House, Senate, and President to be controlled by one party, the founders would be horrified. In fact, if you're going to make them have a party, which they don't want to have political parties, they would want there to be three parties and have one of them in control of each of it. But really, they would want both parties, both houses at least, to almost be split 50-50. So there was constant fighting inside. And then if you as a modern listener goes, which a lot of people will say this, well, gosh, nothing would get done. The founders would go, yes, exactly. Because power is limited.
Right.
Now, in the 21st century, there's a whole other question about how we live our lives in a modern society, 330 some odd million people, mostly in urban settings, which I think does suggest the central government does have to have more power. But they wanted it divided. Another thing that usually you bring up here is the fact that the Constitution has a natural ambiguity. So if you hear people saying originalist, original language, no offense to those people, but you're typically not making stuff up, but you're talking about trying to have a definition of something that you cannot possibly know because that was 250 years ago. No differently than if you ever take a Shakespeare class or you do read the Bible in the King James, you almost need like a scholar sitting beside you to say, what does that word mean? It's an English word. I kind of think I may have heard it before, but I have no idea what they're talking about. And you just don't, it's not even you can't define it, you can't put it in the context of the sentence because it's like almost a different language. And not better or worse, although some people would say it's more pretty or even more intellectual. Regardless, I can't know what's being said. So the founders' language in the Constitution has a natural ambiguity that was intentional, that allows it to flex, which is one reason why, because it can flex, it has survived for now into these 240 years. So I think those are some of the key things, right? And I mentioned the fact that the people were generally afraid of an executive branch because it sounded and smelled too much like a monarchy, which is, again, one of the critics of the Constitution. What they said, again, constitutional thinkers like John Adams and Madison, they wanted there to be an executive branch, so they weren't afraid of that. But when I say they were afraid of it, that doesn't mean we should get rid of the presidency, but we should at least be alerted to the fact that when they set this thing up, they were very nervous about a single leader. If you know the story, which we won't get into this by any stretch, like one of the reasons they had the Electoral College, because they thought the last thing you ever want is for the public to vote for the president. So then you end up with one individual who can walk around kind of cocksure that he and maybe someday she has all the people who love them. The founders were like, we don't want the president ever thinking that. We almost want the president to be detached completely from the people. So then as a good leader, he, and again, someday she, can make decisions that maybe 100% of the people hate. And the president doesn't care because they're acting as the CEO leader that's doing what they perceive to be best for the organization. So those are vastly different than how we live today. Why didn't we really go deeper? Why don't I go deeper on those now? Well, mostly because for this podcast, those facts that those have changed or maybe have been lost are not the point. All of that rests on the fact that for the founders, what was needed was that central moral and virtue foundation. And that's what we've lost. As we said in episode 1, 2, and 3, we're talking about a spiritual issue. Even if we could wave a magic wand and return the system as we know it with all the current inhabitants, all the named people that you can think of, to the 1787 mindset, I would suggest that we would find ourselves incapable of pulling it off because we've lost that core virtue element that Franklin, Washington, Madison, Jefferson, they all talked about as necessary. And that has been our central issue. That's why, we didn't spend more time, looking at the kind of political science aspect of the documents in those last couple of issues. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. This will be a weird metaphor, but I've thought about weight loss and, you could wave a magic wand or liposuction or whatever. I could, just be skinny, but that's only like the temporary or half of the problem, because if you've not done the mental work, then it's not going to stick. So it's a temporary. You're better off doing it the hard way. So it's the secondary thing. We focus on the external thing, but it's the intangible that makes it work.
Right. In that analogy, a simple thing to say is, I want to be healthier, whether it's lose weight or. Are you drinking enough water?
Right.
I'd say nobody, but very few people in this society, in the United States, doesn't have access to water. You may say it doesn't taste the way you want it to taste, or you may have whatever, but you have water. You have water. Are you drinking? If you aren't, then you really don't want to get better. And we can wave whatever magic wands we want, and it won't stick because you won't do this simple, basic thing. And here the simple, basic thing is, as the founders laid out, and as we saw even from our colonization time, and we saw before that even, you have to have the idea of doing a civic government of the people. The thing everybody's like, oh, we're going to lose. If this person gets elected or this thing happens, we're going to lose our thing. And it's like, well, we've actually already lost it. We lost it long before this because we don't have that aspect. And so, that's really what we're trying to argue here is that we had a recipe for this experiment, and it was one of the most successful creations in human history. Again, we said before, I'm not going to say the most, but certainly top 5. If you compared nations or civic entities and their general success, of power or wealth or influence within their sphere, or in our case, globally, you're going to be hard pressed. But it's not just that we have power today. We had this unique structure at our creation. It was one of the very few, if not the only, society created around a set of ideals. It was from the get-go multicultural. Now, it was probably all European, but again, as I tell my students, I'm of Germanic descent. Don't insult me by accusing I'm just like the Irish or I'm just like the Italians. And of course, that's a joke, everybody. But in the sense of everybody makes it, oh, you're just a white guy or you're European. It's like, oh, no. And I'm not even just German. I'm from a specific space in German. Don't put me with those other people in Central Europe. And in the 16 and 1700s, that was absolutely how people thought about it. Even anybody from Sicily, they still think about it today. Don't call a Sicilian Italian or you'll get in trouble, because they view it in a kind of cultural. So they were setting up this multicultural setting. They had that spiritual dimension, which was an important thing, and how they blended, as we've talked about, blended in but not dominant, which was unique of all the societies. Every society had a spiritual dimension, but they had, to use our phrase, church and state together, not separated. And we're like, no, we don't think we should do it that way. And then when you look in the 20th century, again, just saying the positive good of the society, we did all these things and became the most powerful nation on the planet. And then we intentionally acted unlike any other victorious power in human history, as far as things we did, even giving millions of dollars and technological, intellectual know-how to our former enemies. And not former enemies from 500 years before, right, but the guys we just fought a few years ago. The people who killed my brother, now I'm giving that guy money. And that's really unheard of in human history. And so when you tie all that in and you see the economic success for the average people, I mean, we had a great recipe. And now what's coming out of the kitchen, it ain't very good.
Sending that back.
Yeah, exactly. And so what I've argued is that we have at least two groups, two characters who are either adding or subtracting something from the recipe, to use that metaphor. And what we've said, the conservative is maybe trying to add to the metaphor, to the recipe, is Christianity at a governing level. The idea of a Christian nation, Christian nationalism, which is really a modern version of Christendom. And we're going to say that more again, but that's not, you don't want to be there. And what we saw in the evidence is that, yes, we could say this was a, quote, nation peopled mostly with Christians, but there was an intentionality of them not choosing to be a Christian nation. And remember what we saw last episode 10, where we did see at the state level constitutions written that we would say blended church and state. Mm-hmm. And then the founders from those same states said, you know what, at the national level, I don't think we should do that. I mean, again, if some state today in the 21st century thinks they want to go down that road, I guess our founders would say okay, because they did not say in 1787 individual states need to stop what they did. But it's important to note every state that had something in them in a constitution about pro-Christianity reduced it or removed it within the first couple of decades. So the Christians are trying to add something.
Right.
The other character, the progressive, they're seemingly trying to pull things out. And I think, just as I've said, I think maybe Christians would say, oh, I'm not a Christian nationalist. And certainly there are people who are conservative who wouldn't even be Christian necessarily, who are not trying to propose a Christian nationalism, who are frustrated by changes that have been made. And that's fair. Equally true, there would be people on the progressive side who actually there are Christians on the progressive side. And that's a whole nother conversation about within the Christian community or the religious community. So I get it if they're like, oh, no, we're not trying to remove Christianity or even marginalize it. But I'll just say from where Carl sits on the things that I've been in conversations personally at where I work or in life around me, on social media, things I've seen on the news, things I've listened to, European news, I listen to Asian news as well as American news. It clearly feels like that, even if that's not the intent. There's been a variety of domestic governing and cultural choices that have been made. And when those are made, if someone, in my hearing, brings up like a disagreement with those decisions and tries to use Christianity or religion or historic faith position as a reason, then this character has great disdain. Like, they don't engage it authentically to consider maybe there's value in what's being offered. It's just, no, that's kind of ancient, superstitious, religious dogma, and you need to go away. So again, if the Christian's character that we've set up, the conservatives trying to add Christianity to governing level, I think it's fair to say the progressive person is trying to remove something that, again, we've seen in our documents, this idea of the faith issue. And it's important to note people like, say, Jefferson or Franklin, who some could argue, are not Christians, or they certainly don't themselves talk about having a strong Christian ethos. You don't see them talking about going to church or anything like that like you do with other people. They are certainly aware in their speeches and writings that, again, to use that statement, they are in, quote, a nation peopled mostly with Christians. And they themselves value the Christian contribution and the Christian idea as necessary, for the foundation. So I guess that kind of rolls me into this question, or this point of saying, are there solutions that we should consider? Yeah, I think I do want to offer some ideas. I think the first thing we have to decide is, do we even want to go back to what was before? I mean, people may really like it having a dictator's too strong, but it's the one we all understand better of trying to get to the place. And I wish I could have the whole audience here in front of me. It's like, what do you want? Do you really want to be a government of the people or not? Because if you do, there's a lot on our shoulders.
Yeah.
You hear it a lot. And I would say over the past, obviously, you say 25 years of the 21st century, we've had different political leaders of both parties. And I would offer, you hear a lot in people saying when their guy's in charge, like, why doesn't he just do stuff? That why doesn't he just do stuff is asking for the president to have kind of hands on the lever, making decisions like a king, monarch, emperor, dictator. It's not a government of the people. It's a person who says, I know what's best, and I'm going to do the operation of those things.
Yeah, I saw a quote from somebody. I don't know. You have so many conversations, and you're online so much you can't remember where you read something or came across something. And they were saying people generally actually don't want freedom. They want comfortable cages and a reasonable narrative that explains why things are the way they are. It's like, oh, yeah, I think that is it. Yeah, we'll take safety and certainty, and we're willing to pony up some serious basic rights. Yeah, to get a perception of security. Yeah, you're like, well, that's just whatever. No judgment. That's just a contrast, I think, from where our mindset was several generations, several hundred years ago.
Right, and so if you're listening, this is where the solutions start, kind of thing. At this question, I am saying I want to fight for it. I want to strive for it. That's why I teach students at a college. That's why when I talk at whoever I'm talking with, I'm always bringing this stuff up, because I want people to recognize how different things are now. And then that leads to that question, like, do you want to go back? I will note, when you look at our forebears, so Rome and Athens, one of the things that's startling and with foreboding, I suppose, is that though the effort to have government of the people is very difficult to hold and easy to lose. In both places, Athens and Rome, roughly you could, depending on when you want to start and how you want to describe it, that they said, okay, we're starting to do this. And you could say they spent maybe a couple of 100 years massaging it, getting it set up and that kind of a thing. And then from that moment of somebody like a professor of history saying, oh yeah, they did it. They're a democracy in Athens, or they're a republic in Rome. Within a couple 100 years, they lost it. And so one reason I would say that is true is because, as I noted earlier in the series, this idea of government of the people is an aberration from the norm. And the normative state is the power pyramid. When I've said the normative state is the power pyramid, that's not an evil dictator who has gained control. Yes, there are times throughout human history where there's empires that have conquered people, so they're under dominion and they're controlled. But largely what we see is, even in those settings, people going, okay, that's cool. I mean, we have a new king now. We're under a new empire. There's very few rebellions. There's very few uprisings. There's very few, even kind of casual oppositions. I'll just work slower or do less work good. It's like, no, they just keep living.
Yeah.
And so the idea of saying government of the people is very difficult.
Yeah.
And the founders were afraid of this.
I remember going to Russia for a documentary project and speaking to people, and the older generation openly wished for the old days.
And you went after the fall of communism.
Yes, this is well into the early mid-aughts. So yeah, wall's fallen, show's over for a while. Name change, it's the whole thing. And you've got people at that time in their 50s, 60s, 70s pining for the good old days. You're like, wow, that's because it was familiar.
Yeah.
And you can't underestimate the power of that.
Yeah, and it's easy, which, by the way, not to get off sidetracked, if you pay attention since World War II, which when I've generally said our problems have emerged, one of the things that you get consistently from the presidents is a statement of an often statement of things are fine, things are fine, things are good, spend more money. In fact, we'll give you here's $100, go spend some more money. And why are they telling you that? Well, maybe to kickstart the economy, but they're wanting us to not look too deeply. And now what I'm saying is don't look too deeply at what the government's doing. That's probably a part of it. What I'm saying, where we need to look deeply is internally. So if you say, okay, look, I'm with you, Carl. I want this return. I want us to return to the healthy recipe. I want the right mix, and I want us to have that flourishing we used to have. Then we need then to join, as the Athenians, Romans tried to do, and we tried to do, and believe that the foundation needs to be taught to our children. So if you want solutions, here they are. So this is one of our major conclusions. Jefferson believed this. That's why he helped start the University of Virginia. Adams believed this, and so in him writing the Constitution for Massachusetts, education was required, and that it be teach and pass on to the children the moral and virtue foundation. The earliest founders in our first Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress, when they passed the series of Northwest Territory ordinances that helped create the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, etc., those guys, they put in there this statement: religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary for good government, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. So the founders were worried from the get-go that we could lose this, and they often said aloud they worried that people were already kind of losing their way, but hence the education. The education part was what was critical for us to kind of make our way forward in sustaining. Okay. So the answer to the overall podcast starts with acknowledging the country was good. The founding was beneficial. Everybody here, people who've been born here, or the bulk of us who either us or our ancestors immigrated here and obviously haven't left, have been blessed by the outcome of the experiment. We've done good things. And so we're positioning ourselves as trying to recover that recipe. So if we're going to teach that virtue foundation, what are we going to teach? Again, this is now just Carl's offering that we have to teach one. Now, I said this previously, and in one sense, I'm still thinking about doing a whole other season of Unmoored that would really dig in deeply on this. But let me just say briefly, I and you, Matthew, are Christians. And so I would offer that Christianity is still not only historic, but it's still right for today. But to defend that, I'd need more time, and I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to back up and just say, in our time with a multi-pluralistic society that has a variety of worldviews and now a variety of religious expressions, there's still common ground.
Yeah.
So we could say, without fear of having a sectarian, Christian only, or even more narrow, like the Puritans, only my definition or my denomination of Christianity, we could say, what if we stepped back from that and looked at some of the common areas that we have, that we as the people of the United States could say, yes, this is part of that virtue foundation that I think would be beneficial. I think that's doable. So what are some of those things? Well, I'm not saying every religion says this, but I think in my expression, including some of my friends who claim an atheistic position or who are kind of on that crowd of saying, well, I don't really have a religion at all, nuns or whatever. Some of the common ground is that there's a love or a respect for the neighbor. Mm-hmm. And often the statement is to love the neighbor as I love myself. There's a whole bunch of stuff you could talk about with that regard. But if I start with thinking my neighbor is another human,
right,
and I can start with having some general respect, including with the neighbor who's got the wrong flag out front, has got the wrong political sign out front, or if I just start with that position, that's beneficial. That I think every religion that I know of, world religion, has a moderation in possessions, so not an accrual of more, but a respect of that I can be moderate, which gives me the flexibility then to use my financial resources to care for the other, to care for the immigrant, to be careful with the visitor, to care for the least. Right? The other may not be least. The other may be somebody who's well off, but I can still show that respect to them. Mm-hmm. That in my work, and this was a key part of what the founders thought of when they thought of virtue, that in my work, I can have an integrity to my task, to the doing of my task, both with the idea of doing a job well and to the benefit of the other who receives my work. I mean, again, not to get too sidebar, but if you talk to my mother who's 84, turning 84 in another month, she'll tell you repeatedly her feeling of nobody does good jobs anymore. Nobody cares about the quality of their work anymore. Well, that's probably not fair to say nobody feels like that. But I do feel like there's an aspect in which you could say, yeah, I get that. It does feel like people are sort of mailing it in for a lot of different reasons. And again, what I'm saying here, this is a place that we could teach this to our children to say, regardless of religious worldview in particular, this is something that we value, that you should find a virtue in doing your work to the very best of your ability. One, for the honoring of that work, and then two, back to point one here, of caring and honoring for the other. Right? Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. It's unassailable so far for my money.
Well, if we did this and we taught this to our children, and I mean literally, I guess in our day and age, we're forced with having to work through state agencies connected to education. But if we said to our local community, our local school boards, and ultimately to our state school boards, we want this in our society. We're not imposing any specific religious viewpoint, but we are talking about, and I don't even want to call it a teaching of civics, because when you do that, it kind of gets off into that political sciencey stuff that I mentioned earlier, which I value, and I also think that's crucial. We should be teaching a civics, and with that civics, a love for country. Let me restate yet again, this is a good country. If you live here, you're fortunate. And if you think it's horrible for some reason, you easily have access to leave. Nobody can keep you here. Right. And there's lots of places you could go. So go to those places, right? But when you say, no, it's a good country, let's teach our children that. Warts and all, things we should say, we need to learn from this failure before, but let's teach them that it's good. And then to keep this system, we need this moral virtue foundation. And we're not going to impose one religion or one narrow viewpoint of a certain faith in on it. But there are these commonalities that at the broad spectrum, if we taught our children just these things, I think it would be huge in how we go forward. Yeah. Add to that what you expect from elected officials. Right. And I mean, there's obviously a whole story there about elections. I think asking our elected officials to live things out that we say we value is a part of saying government of the people, that government is us. And then having the bravery, regardless of political party, to not vote for somebody who doesn't live it out in their personal life. And yes, if that means, I'm a certain political party, I'm going to have to vote for somebody at another political party, yes, because you're going to send a message to your own party or to your own group, and you're going to say openly, nope, I didn't vote for you, I voted for the other team, and the reason I didn't vote for the other, voted for them and not for you is because you don't live out these core, simple values that we say are necessary for our society. If you did that, besides the fact you might overturn and get rid of a bunch of people, and it would send a message. And then people would run who you could find in alignment with some of the maybe functional domestic policies, things you need to have done, but you'd be doing it on all of us on this common foundation that we've said are like useful or best for us to do the whole thing well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. It seems like we have, I've thought about it before. It just as a snapshot. Let's say you've got a person who's conservative and they want to manage natural resources as is common to that side, and you've got somebody over here that thinks the world's all these evil corporations are. Hey, could you guys go get together on Saturday and clean up the lake?
Yeah,
we don't have to hash it all out.
Yeah,
we don't even have to come to any common ground. But is there not room to do something constructive together without anybody coming to the other side? But where's the fun in that, I guess?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's back to am I going to drink water or am I going to complain about the health thing? Am I going to do the simple thing I can do?
Exactly. Yeah. So I agree with what you're saying there.
Look, I fully concede, in case anybody's wondering at all, that in the early 21st century, we are not anymore, to use my quote from before, a nation peopled mostly with Christians. I'm not going to suggest that. I'm not going to say, hey, it doesn't matter, you still have to do the Christian thing. I'm not saying that. I'm not going to argue that the discussion should be something about let's choose Christianity. My point in this podcast has been to note our current distress is due to the fact that our system, a system of the people, depends upon the foundation of morality and virtue. Without it, you end up in that might makes right viewpoint every time, and you end up in that place where, if the guy in charge or the person in charge or the team in charge you agree with, maybe you'll be happy under the benevolent dictator. But then I don't want to hear one complaint out of you when the other team gets in charge. And then they bring the thunder down and do horrible things from your point of view that are painful for you. We end up in a dark, dark place, and you've seen it throughout history. There's no reason for us to end up there. But the only way out of that is to accept what our founders set up and say that recipe we need to preserve. So my hope is throughout the whole podcast, to have sparked your curiosity to think how we can restore some, internal spiritual foundation. I'm not saying here it must be Christianity. I'm saying it was Christianity, and that I think has merit. And I do think that should speak to everyone. But I'm not going to now try to argue we're just got to make everybody Christians or something, because that's not helpful. I hope then everybody listening will start the process of searching and investigating with me and with your neighbors some of the things that are common to viewpoint that can be a spiritual foundation. But it can never be imposed from government. If you still think the solution is who we elect, or if we elect the right people, they can impose this idea that I just suggested, that's not going to happen. It has to happen interior for us. Maybe I'll do a season 2, and I'll do another thing of Unmoored, and I'll talk about why I think the Christian thing still has merit in the 21st century. But that's not today.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.